Hi, I'm author and publisher Mark David Welsh, and today's video is the second in a short series where I'll be covering the 4 forgotten, obscure science fiction novels that British-based Amicus Films made into movies in the 1960s. And today we get The Gods Hate Kansas. So if you're not familiar, Amicus were the big British rival to the Hammer film studio in the latter part of the 1960s and the first half of the 1970s. Now they enjoyed significant success with what was called at the time portmanteau films, what we would now call anthologies. However, they also enjoyed significant box office success in the mid-60s with 2 adaptations of the Doctor Who franchise, starring Peter Cushing, and this inspired them to release a quartet of standalone science fiction movies over the next few years, and they were all based on obscure novels, and that's what I'll be discussing in this series. And today it's the turn of The Gods Hate Kansas by Joseph J. Millard, which Amicus turned into a movie called They Came from Beyond Space. The plot of this one involves some meteorites which crash down to Earth and land on a remote farm in Kansas. Now NASA get pretty excited about this because the meteorites fell in formation, which is obviously completely unprecedented. So NASA Big Cheese Van Arden sends in a special team of scientists who are experts in meteorites. Now this team is normally led by Dr. Curtis Temple, but he can't go because he's still recuperating after a serious plane accident 6 months earlier, where he sustained injuries so bad that doctors had to insert a metal plate into his head. So instead the team is led by Lee Mason, who is Temple's assistant and girlfriend. And for a few days everything seems fine. He's receiving regular telephone calls from her and also data reports. But then everything goes silent, and all he gets is second-hand news of extravagant purchases of equipment, of building materials, lumber, cement, electrical cable, and miles of steel fencing. Now Temple can't contact any of his team down there, phone calls go unanswered, so he decides to go down there, obviously against his doctor's wishes, and one of his colleagues at the university where he works offers him a lift. But when he goes to get into the car, he feels a strange sensation, and suddenly he finds himself bundled out on the sidewalk and the car speeding away. So Temple goes down to the site himself, only to find that what used to be a farm is now more like an armed military camp. He's refused entry, but he does manage to get a brief interview with Lee, but confusingly she seems completely emotionless, cold, almost robotic, and basically just tells him to go away. On the way back into town he runs into an FBI man named Stillwell who has the camp under surveillance. But before Stillwell can really tell Temple anything, he collapses and dies, the first victim of something that becomes known as the Crimson Plague. Now the disease is 100% fatal and super contagious, spreading like wildfire, eventually becoming an existential threat to humanity. Temple is convinced that it's linked to what is going on in that armed camp and the meteorites, so he is determined to investigate and discover the truth. Now this is a fast-moving slice of pulpy science fiction that originally debuted in a magazine called Startling Stories, and as such it's breezy and undemanding stuff, but not without flaws, particularly the Crimson Plague element, which does feel very awkward and ill-fitting. However, the main issue is really the final act, when Temple travels to the moon of all places, and what's been pulp before turns into a definite slab of cheese. Now, given some of the plot developments at this stage, and particularly the dialogue, it's hard to imagine that Millard was still taking his story that seriously, and it really does expose his limitations as a writer. But in his defence, The Gods Hate Kansas is a wonderful title, and it is explained in the novel. Basically, Temple talks about how more meteorites land there than anywhere else on Earth, and it does turn out there's actually a reason for that. It's not true, of course. more meteorites are discovered in Antarctica than anywhere else, although that's probably due to the fact that conditions make them easier to discover there. Or it could be, perhaps, because it's where the Shoggoths live. I don't know. Also, there's an abundance of overly familiar alien invasion tropes here. The extraterrestrials come in meteorites. They take over humans to do their bidding, including high government officials, which results in a cover-up while they build their large factory-like installation, which is off-limits to all outsiders. Sound familiar? Well, that's the plot to Quatermass 2, written by Nigel Kneale, which debuted on British television in 1955 before Hammer made a movie of it 2 years later. And in 1954, American author Jack Finney delivered his definitive tale of alien invasion and human possession with The Body Snatchers, which was most famously filmed, of course, in 1956 as Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And if you want a really great science fiction book, or just a great book full stop, check that one out. It's really brilliant. Other elements of Millard's story also echo Jack Arnold's movie It Came From Outer Space from 1953, which was based on an original story idea by famous science fiction novelist Ray Bradbury. But just when you're about to dismiss The Gods Hate Kansas as a cheap, shameless knockoff of all that other work, here's the thing. When it debuted in Startling Stories, the year was 1941. More than a decade before anything else that I just talked about. Now, I think I've got a pretty good knowledge of science fiction cinema pre that date, and I can't think of anything that really matches those elements beyond a little bit of mind control which turned up in a few Hollywood serials and the like. However, I would be the first to admit I don't have an extensive knowledge of science fiction literature of that period, so those ideas may have been present earlier. Certainly we've obviously had the original alien invasion novel in 1898, which was War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, but there may have been others that used elements that then Millard took. But then again, he may have come up with some of this stuff himself. Perhaps if you know of any other stories which actually fit that bill that were published before 1941, you can enlighten me in the comments. I'd certainly be grateful for that. It's also worth mentioning that the text in the edition I've read for this review has been revised at some stage. The copyright date or the renewal date in the book is 2014. And I know that there have been some changes at least because it mentions NASA. And NASA did not exist in 1941. They came into being in 1958. So something at least has been changed there. So in short, this is a fairly enjoyable, if undemanding, piece of mid-20th century science fiction. It's pulpy. It's more than a bit cheesy, especially towards the end, but you can breeze through it in a couple of sittings, and although it won't leave much of a mark on your memory, it's a decent enough time passer. Amicus producer and co-head of the studio Milton Subotsky seemed to like it anyway, because he was the one who seems to have been behind the movie adaptation I'm going to talk about next, and in fact authored the screenplay for it. Unsurprisingly, the film got a title change, because British locations would have had a pretty tough job standing in for the wheat fields of Kansas. So, the new title was They Came From Beyond Space, and the film mostly played on double bills with The Terranauts, and unsurprisingly, it shares some of the faults and flaws of that film, mainly due, of course, down to a considerable lack of money. In fact, director Freddie Francis complained that there was no budget because Amicus had spent all their money on the Terranauts. Now, I don't know if he was joking or being sarcastic here, it's impossible to say. And there's no budgetary information about They Came From Beyond Space that I could actually find, so I don't know, but it's clearly a very cheap production. And the question again arises, if you haven't got any money, why are you trying to make these kind of films? Why not do something a little more achievable? And the most obvious issue there is the fact that the armed camp in the movie still looks very much like a small farm, even after the invasion has begun. All we really see of anything is a guard post on the road. that's about it. There is a decent model work for a rocket launch by Les Bowie again. Certainly not 2001 standard, but not at all bad, and much better than anything he achieved in the Terranauts. It is an isolated moment of quality though, as most of the sets and props are simply recycled from the Daleks Invasion Earth 2150 AD, the second Doctor Who movie that Amicus had made the year before. The other obvious budgetary problem here is trying to depict the global devastation caused by the Crimson Plague. We don't see any of that, just a couple of talking heads on a TV screen discussing the problem. There is a reporter who does an on-location report from the village near the armed camp, but that's your lot. Ironically, he was actually played by BBC newscaster Kenneth Kendall, who became a mainstay of the BBC 9 o'clock news throughout the 1970s and 1980s. However, on the plus side, director Freddie Francis was a two-time Oscar-winning cinematographer, and he reaches deep into his bag of tricks to try and keep things at least visually interesting. He uses different lenses, some unusual angles, and there's a vaguely psychedelic feel to some of the interiors. Unfortunately, he's fighting a losing battle against a lackluster script, a dull cast, and a few scattered so bad they're good moments, including Temple's device for preventing your brain being taken over by the alien blobs. This resembles nothing so much as a kitchen colander. To save embarrassment, they hide it later by putting it inside motorcycle helmets instead of space helmets. The one smart decision Subotsky does make with his script is to strip out some of the sillier aspects of the final act, so some of that cheese is missing. And you do get the wonderful Michael Gough playing the Master of the Moon, dressed like he's about to go entertaining at a children's party, or maybe doing a cheap conjuring act at the end of the pier in somewhere like Brighton or Southsea. So there's not much entertainment value here, to be honest, as the movie plods along to its underwhelming conclusion. Now, they came from beyond space, played mostly on double bills with the studio's equally disappointing film, The Terranauts, but that didn't put them off. They went on to make two more science fiction projects over the next few years, and both were based on novels. There was Scream and Scream Again in 1969, which was based on a novel called The Disorientated Man, and The Mind of Mr. Soames in 1970, and I'll be covering both of those in future videos. Would I recommend that you seek out The God Sake Kansas? Well, maybe, if you're curious, but I can't help thinking you probably got far better ways to spend your reading time. Well, that's it for today's video. Thank you very much for staying with me all the way to the end. It's much appreciated. And please do all those things with the buttons that YouTube has asked you to do. So until the next time, when I'll be discussing some more forgotten books, I'll be seeing you.